So, starting the new session, welcome back. I'm going to be building a kind of first aid kit right now, just to help people who have decided on journeying on a spiritual path as a lifestyle or as an aim that they want to kind of work towards. The importance of this is to help us maintain a focus and realize how we want to decide the questions that we want to kind of sidestep because we know already that they're just going to kind of create a circular reasoning that's not going to help us really achieve any kind of substantial understanding that's going to help us in a kind of actionable way in the world. So, to begin, maintain a diverse support system. My beginning journey was one that didn't really have a support system. I had studied religion, or as I mentioned, I had kind of gone to a session outside of school and outside, like with my family when I was about 14 or 15 years old. And I spent about 20 years kind of studying it on and off, kind of informally, and just by going to different conferences and some kind of do-it-yourself YouTube videos and reading, and decided to do it formally at 26 by going to a postgrad program at Carleton. And I did it alone. I mean, my parents kind of stayed with me at the time, so it was good that that was something that was kind of anchoring me as this is part of my old life, as it were. And as I'm changing and evolving as into who I'm becoming, having that unchanged in my life really helped. So I didn't feel like I have nothing that's familiar to help me sort of come out of my mind and into something that's a little bit normal that I can kind of take a break from and go back into without having everything kind of blur as just one big blob, and I have no way of understanding how to think clearly anymore. Um, so, to begin, I think having a journal is a good idea. Just something that you can kind of write out some of the questions that you have and kind of refer back to them, and maybe even have a starting point of this is what my beliefs were, and this is the reason maybe I had these beliefs, and they resonate with me for this reason. And then as you come across new ways of thinking or are questioned with maybe a secular viewpoint about reality, allow yourself to take it really slowly and take the time to kind of meditate on foreign ideas and see how you react to them initially. So if it's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction that like, no, I would never believe this, or this is like completely outside of realm, um, that's of comfort to me, then go with that. Like, don't just write it off and say, I'm not going to revisit it again, because your mind will. And you believe it or not, it's just going to be something that sits on the back of your mind, like kind of like a back burner, and it'll create anxiety eventually if you don't try to address it. So write down the question. You don't have to address it right away, but at least you have that somewhere written down and recorded, so that if perchance you're studying something or you're reading something or you're listening to something and it almost feels like, hey, that kind of answers that question that I had, then it's there and you don't have to worry about what was that question and how did I think about it first. And so just have that kind of, so you almost have like a method already kind of established for how you want to continue. Um, and be careful with enlisting family help. I mean, I know I just mentioned that having a constant in my life was helpful, but sometimes and it comes from a good place, that they almost want to help by reiterating what they already know. And that's good because it makes sense for them, and it's almost like, well, why are you questioning it? And it's a fair assessment, because sometimes, I mean, if you're in a kind of environment where you have people talking about a discourse that's completely alien to you and you have no reference for it other than your tradition, you're going to want to learn about it so that you can engage with them. So having somebody who is going to help you kind of create a bridge between what your tradition is and then what you're currently learning might be something you want to invest in kind of establishing. So, like I mentioned, having some kind of Facebook groups, like really diverse ones that you can maybe post your questions and then kind of build ideas around what people's feedbacks are. And, maybe then you can kind of build personal connections with people, and just say, I've been studying this, and is this okay if we maybe just talk about it and create friendships that way and network? Um, and then if you've kind of decided that after kind of like a broad preview of all the traditions that you want to commit to one, um, don't feel like you have to almost wear the label that comes with it. So if you decide, I want to study Christianity, and as you're studying it, you feel like, should I call myself a Christian? Like, am I supposed to? I don't know. To each your own. You have to kind of feel comfortable with how you want to ascribe to yourself an affiliation with a group. Um, it's very broad. I don't know very much about Christianity. What I do know is from what I studied, like kind of like a surface study of different narratives of prophets in the communities that were mentioned in the Quran. So the Quran discusses all of the narratives. So like it goes through Moses and Abraham and Jonah, all of these prophets and Jesus, and it refers to them as prophets. So monotheism and strict monotheism is something that's consistent across the three traditions that we know as the Abrahamic faiths. With the Vedas, believe it or not, it is a monotheistic religion. It's very because it's so ancient and it's kind of devolved into many ways of understanding how the attributes of God can be embodied in people, like in avatars. It looks like they've segmented God into all these different mini gods almost. So it's almost like a mythological understanding of how to understand the universe. So, I mean, that's something to think about too. Um, and then, yeah, so keep in mind that because going into a tradition is going to almost make it feel like you're committing to it, try to understand what the methodology that's used is, because you'll find that each tradition has a philosophy of thinking and has scholars that almost use texts to arrive at conclusions regarding how do we practice this or implement this in the world, in this context, with this group of people, with this population. And it starts to get really specific. So as you're studying different traditions, you might find that you're kind of grasping the method for how scholars used to kind of derive meanings and conclusions of how to be in the world based on scripture. So I mentioned before that to what degree do scriptures kind of meet an aim of a group? You'll find that this is what it is. It really helps you not just read the scripture and then lift the verse and then say, okay, I guess this is what it means literally. It's a lot deeper than that. And once you kind of get into it, you'll find that you can kind of take a postmodern approach. Like this might take years for you and maybe not, depending on um, how in depth you want to get. But once you do, you'll be able to kind of adapt your own way of arriving at conclusions. And again, keep it personal. Don't try to, I recommend personally, I don't recommend that you try to kind of build a Bible study around it and preach it, because this is kind of where conflicts can arise, where people say, well, what qualifications do you have to come to these conclusions? And some traditions may be a little bit more particular about that than others. And so just to kind of minimize things from kind of spiraling out of control and creating negative feelings between communities or cultures, or even within one tradition, maybe start with just keeping it a little bit like a personal journey. And then if you decide that people are starting to think the way you do, maybe it can be like a collective way of just like a small group study between friends or something. That's, I think, I mentioned this before, is that maybe before delving into the different philosophies of religious rulings, or how to practice within a tradition kind of in a holistic way. So it's almost like if you've come to the point where I want to subscribe to Islam as my religion and I want to become Muslim, it almost seems that you're committing to a holistic and comprehensive way of life. So you've almost committed to, I want to embody all of this in my life. And I hesitate to say that that's something you should jump into right away, because first of all, it's very easy. Like you're probably going to find that you can identify with all the faiths and just say, if I'm going to identify with monotheism, or just that the universe can be described as just one energy that devolves into all this diversity, then you're already there. You don't necessarily need to kind of figure out, how do I pick one of these divisions and associate with them. Um, but if you decide to do that, uh, you will find that finding a methodology or a school of thought will be helpful, so that you're not contradicting yourself in any way. So you'll find that there's going to be rituals of prayer, for example, and then rituals of fasting and rituals of. So these things you can kind of approach slowly. Don't feel like you need to take it on all at once. And you'll find the reason for why these rituals are kind of prescribed, and the metaphysical impact they can have on you spiritually. And people decide to engage in them for different reasons. If you feel like it's a good thing to do collectively without really talking about people, I'm sorry, talking with people about your philosophy of thinking, that might be a good thing. Like, kind of almost like when you think of meditating or getting together for yoga classes, it's kind of like that. You just kind of get together, you kind of enjoy the ambience of the music and the calming effect of having the different poses, and that's basically it. It's still kind of like a restorative way of calming your mind, and just maybe focusing on something that relieves some of the tensions of the world that kind of create anxiety. So I think what I'm trying to say there is, a summary of the major religions might be enough for you, but if you feel like you want more, then I think the next step might be, okay, I want to maybe study more in depth about one particular tradition and find out what the rituals are and what the metaphysical significance is for practicing these rituals. And trust your intuition. So keep your intuition focused on self-healing, self-development, and meaning. And you'll find that life will open up in a very optimistic way. Like you'll just find that there's ease, and that just kind of facilitates for you. And you can argue that this is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if you're almost allowing your mind to remain calm and to look forward to, I'm going to be able to take this time out of my busy day and just relax, and I don't have to do anything stressful during this moment other than just let my brain kind of meditate on some meaning, your approach to life will be less almost rushed or busy. Like you'll just find your way of life might be a little bit more thought out or deliberate, which is it's a nice way of kind of slowing down and just appreciating every moment of your day rather than kind of rushing through it. Like I think we're kind of coming out of that stage of society where we're just used to like the hustle and bustle of life, and you have to get through one day and almost, thank God I got through the day, and then, well, here's another day tomorrow. I hope things go smoothly and you don't really get this time off. Outside of this is kind of a segue. Keep in mind that struggles are inherent in life. So I mentioned that spiritually, you will find yourself facilitated towards more meaning, and you'll feel calmer and more aligned with your true kind of temperament or how you want to be in the world. But that won't negate that struggles will cease to exist. You're still going to come up against ways of, having to resolve discontent with anything really. Sometimes, especially in this scenario, it'll be how can I explain to friends, for example, if I don't want to do some of the extracurricular activities I used to join them with. So finding ways to assume that I want to keep you as a circle of friends and maybe a circle of trust still. And maybe we don't have to have all the same overlapping kind of interests that we might have in the past. And then just think about it, like maybe list that in your journal. Like, what challenges do I assume I can come up against, and how would I want to resolve them? And just aim for patience. Don't be derailed, and keep your boundaries in place. This is particularly important when you have family and friends that are almost like at a kind of crossroad. Like, why have you chosen to kind of think outside of your tradition? Like, what's wrong with your tradition right now, or our tradition? And do you have any questions that we can answer? And that typically is the response, as though if the tradition I'm currently in is satisfactory, does studying other traditions mean that somehow threatened, or like, if should people feel threatened that I'm studying other traditions? And this is something that I always find to be a conundrum, because it's like the Quran clearly mentions that they're not meant to negate each other. They're meant to kind of add to the previous narrative. So it's a stepping stone. It's almost like this one was at this point in time, and then building on it was this. It might have also negated some of the practices in the past, because they're not really relevant to the world as it gets more and more kind of civilized. So to think that um, any path backwards, just to kind of, maybe I just need a more robust understanding of something, and maybe this traditional offer it is a threat, is something that I wish people would stop kind of assuming. There's nothing wrong with any other traditions as far as I can see. I think they all have elements of truth that resonate with people in different ways, depending on what their backgrounds are and what their kind of lifestyle is like. And then take time to reflect on the feedback that you receive from friends in spite of all this. So even though you have your boundaries in place, just so that you're not closing yourself in entirely, um, if you're having some discussions, or you're getting some kind of feedback about, you're really changing a lot, and we really don't know, like sometimes you'll have interventions, right? And it gets to that point. For me personally, what I've done is I've just actually like wrote these assessments down and almost stepped into them. So if I get the response of, you look like you're depressed because you don't talk very much anymore, and you're kind of self-retreating, you don't really get involved with your friends anymore, um, to me it's almost like, okay, well, if I step into that, what is wrong with that? Like, how is retreating to understand spiritual meaning linked with depression? So to me, it could be almost because sometimes circles of friends have kind of like an established norm, and changing from that norm is, like any change, is almost like there's resistance to it. So we like things to stay the same, and you had this kind of dynamic to the group, and now we don't have it anymore. So it's almost like any kind of change, you're always going to be met with some kind of resistance. So keep that in mind, and feel free to draw your boundaries and say, if you're not going to support me in this way, then I can see where we have to part ways, and let it just stay at that. Um, and if things do seem like they're unfair assessments, like some people will assume that because you're retreating, you're becoming really conservative, or you're looking like a fanatic, or any of the kind of extremes one way or another, like you're becoming way too liberal. You don't even have to defend yourself. Like, you're free to practice your way of thinking as they are. One of the things I struggled with was, if somebody is suggesting that the way you're studying or you're practicing your faith is blank, so liberal, for example, like it's too loose, then my immediate response is, okay, but we know that you can't really um, force someone into a practice or a belief, because it's supposed to emanate from within. It's supposed to be like faith based. So if I don't believe that this is going to work for me, and I'm practicing it in an outward way to almost um, assuage a certain group or relieve them in any way, like, what have I, for me as a personal uh, investor in spiritual growth, really done for myself? So it's become something that's out of my control now. Like, I'm seeking their pleasure over my own spiritual fitness. So this is something to kind of really keep in mind, and it's often something that's not really thought about. Traditionally, it's usually, let's keep things the same and let's be collective, like with our our practices and maintain each other's kind of like support system, and that's good. But there comes a time, and especially now in contemporary times, where we are free to kind of think about things in a new way. Um, there's there's no way of saying that what's meaningful for one person isn't going to be meaningful for the other, and vice versa. So just be careful not to get in those kind of struggles where you always have to defend yourself, or it's easier to just say, as mentioned in the Quran, for example, like, you have your way and I have my way. We don't have to compete about this, because essentially the idea is to do it for yourself, or if you want to think outside of yourself, it's for God, for your own karmic kind of future to reinforce itself in a positive way for you. And there's no benefit in other people forcing you to comply with what they think is the right way of practicing. So that used to be a rhetoric, as though, having people enjoying each other in good is encouraged. But if you don't start by focusing on yourself, it's almost like assuming that I'm not going to know if the company that I'm almost affiliating with is what isn't needed of me. So it's almost to say that if I am kind of worried about my own spiritual fitness and I'm working on things on my own, I might just find that certain people kind of gravitate around me. So we are like, almost, you can say that you are the company that you keep, right? So if you find yourself affiliating with people who just kind of practice minimally, or don't really show like that they're practicing in a very conservative way, and maybe don't talk about it at all, those are usually the types of friends that I kind of prefer to have, because if you have any kind of conundrums, you can kind of approach them without thinking that they're going to have to give you an answer right away. It could be just, oh, this is something that's like food for thought for me. And then for you, just kind of thinking it out loud. Sometimes for you, it almost like, oh, wait. And then your mind already starts thinking of a solution. And sometimes that's all it is. And I guess that's it. I'm going to stop the session here. Next session, I'm going to write. So I almost have a list of some of the really big questions that people have about predestination and destiny and fate and free will. This is typically where people do have a lot of struggles with religion, where, if God exists, why is there a difficulty? Why do we have evil in the world? Why do we have choice? And then on the other end, it's, well, why don't we have freedom of choice? Like, we should have free will. And all those questions are valid within space and time. But if you kind of pull out of that and just assume existence, and you don't really have a way of specifying how one person's action somewhere may influence another person's action somewhere else, and then you put space and time in, you'll find that it's almost like the printing press. So in the 1400s, for example, I don't know necessarily the exact time, you had information about the Bible spreading, and that led to the Enlightenment and Protestantism. So it's almost like one really big phenomenon leads to another, and it has almost like an effect in the world that we can almost go in and out of time and place with. So it's not to say that if we didn't have the printing press, we wouldn't have had the progress out of orthodoxy. You can think that, and maybe see how some traditions who haven't had that sort of enlightenment or reform, how they've kind of coped. And then you can put the context of violence in, and why such change, or drastic change from something that's kind of supposed to be understood to be rooted and unchanging, causes that much difficulty with people and communities. So if you understand things in that way, understanding the nature of life might be easier. Like, it'll just all seem like it does all sustain itself in a very kind of creative way. So something to think about there, and I'll see you next session.